This is going to be a review of the film My Friend Dahmer and a comparison to the graphic novel that it is based on by John Backderf. John Backderf was a classmate of Dahmer's and a friend or acquaintance of his from his sophomore year of high school through just after his senior year. This story is described as being the story before that story being Jeffrey Dahmer eventually growing up to kill at least 17 young men and sexually mutilate their bodies. He did also eat parts of the corpses. When approaching this content, I find a paragraph that is at the beginning of the graphic novel to be extremely important to keep in mind. So I'm going to read that to you in the author's own words. It's my belief that Dahmer didn't have to wind up a monster, that all those people didn't have to die horribly, if only the adults in his life hadn't been so inexplicably, unforgivably, incomprehensibly clueless and indifferent. Once Dahmer kills, however, I can't stress this enough, my sympathy for him ends. He could have turned himself in after the first murder. He could have put a gun to his head. Instead, he, and he alone, chose to become a serial killer and spread misery to countless people. There are a surprising number out there who view Jeffrey Dahmer as some kind of anti-hero, a bullied kid who lashed back at the society that rejected him. This is nonsense. Dahmer was a twisted wretch whose depravity was almost beyond comprehension. Pity him, but don't empathize with him. I think we have to remember the difference between empathy and pity. We don't want to identify with Dahmer, but we do want to understand Dahmer. You don't want to start trying to see yourself in him and trying to compare yourself to him in any kind of a positive way. There's no positive interpretation or spin on what he did. Jeffrey Dahmer was a murderer who killed at least 17 innocent people, and that is the bottom line. Jeffrey Dahmer was not the victim in this story. The victims were the people that he killed, and I think we always need to keep that present and always need to keep that relevant. Nothing that happened to Jeffrey Dahmer is on par with what he visited upon these other human beings. So please keep that in mind again, that this is a story that does involve real people and that is relevant to the real pain of so many families. Now I'm going to go ahead and review the movie, now that I've gotten really, really heavy with you.
Take a deep breath. Another deep breath.
Out of the way, dumbass.
You're trying to take them away from him.
What are you talking about?
You wouldn't know about the kids because you're not at home anymore.
And one more time. You seem healthy to me.
What about what's on a patient's mind?
Jeff's a little off, you know? I think he's kind of hilarious.
I like bones. It interests me. What's inside?
I see things in you that I don't like about myself. I want you to have friends in ways that I never could.
I'm just like anybody else. He's not a sideshow attraction.
Are you okay?
Get out of your shell. You need to be more normal.
I now present to you Jeffrey Dahmer in his command performance.
So overall, the film was very, very faithful to the graphic novel. I thought that the film was very, very well written. It was well acted, Ross Lynch, the actor who plays Dahmer, who's actually a former Disney Channel star, did a stunning job of portraying the character and bringing him to life. I have seen some of Dahmer's interviews, and the mannerisms, the appearance, just all of these little details were very well mimicked by this actor. He did an incredible job. It was unsettling. And the feeling throughout this entire film was unsettling. It was uncomfortable, and there were all of these moments where you could just feel the tension and where you could feel it going off the rails. The film is very, very sparing with how it uses musical scores. It tends to have a lot of ambient sounds in the background instead rather than music, except for in a couple of scenes. And I think this is very effective for continuing to cultivate this realistic and very creepy atmosphere. Another thing that adds an element of realism, which I'm not sure how I feel about, is that they shot a lot of the scenes in Dahmer's house in his actual childhood home. This kind of bothers me because this is the home where the first murder took place and where the body of the first victim was kept for quite some time. And it does feel a little sensationalist to use it for a film instead of simply recreating it for the movie on a set or a soundstage. I understand why they made the choice they made. I do understand that it adds a layer of authenticity, but there's just something about that rubs me the wrong way a little bit. The acting for the parents is really, really competent and does a good job of showing a really broken home. There were some major changes between the graphic novel and the film. First of all, they cut the middle school prologue completely. They cut out the character of Kent, who was one of the members of the Dahmer fan club. They expanded the role of his brother and his parents considerably. The character Fig in the comics, who's kind of just a brutish sort of kid, is basically changed to a scary version of the hustler kid from Recess, but this one has a gun and plays Russian roulette and is oh so edgy and has knives and stuff. And there's a weird scene with him and Dahmer that I think was cheesy and that they added to the movie to obviously add another level of creepy, but honestly it just seemed unnecessary, and again, sort of like they were adding a little unnecessary sensationalism. The jogger, who is a big part of both the graphic novel and the film, who did actually run past Jeffrey Dahmer's house in real life, was expanded in the film to be a doctor who then has a scene with Jeffrey Dahmer where he gives him an exam, and there's some tension in that scene. Again, it felt like that was just done to add some extra drama, and it didn't feel necessary to the narrative, to be completely honest. There's also a scene at the end where Backderf picks Jeff up while he's walking home and then offers him all of the drawings that he's done of him, and Jeff refuses them, and they have this conversation in the car, and then he briefly goes inside. None of that happened in the graphic novel or in real life. In real life, Backderf does not remember the last time that he saw Dahmer, and it was actually the character with the pseudonym of Mike in the comic that picked up Dahmer, and he didn't go in the house with him. They just sat in the driveway and talked a little bit. It wasn't nearly as dramatic a scene as it's played up in the movie. And again, I understand why they did that, but it didn't ultimately feel all that necessary to the narrative. It just felt like another moment to make him extra creepy and menacing, and I don't really see the point of doing that. He's already creepy enough, and the knowledge that he would go on to brutally murder 17 people kind of cements that status. You don't really need to worry about me not being creeped out by the actual serial killer. There were some minor changes as well, like altering the order of some scenes, and there were some little things with the divorce timeline and expanding Derf's role that they did to serve the narrative or to simplify the plot, which I don't really have that much of a problem with. The most faithful aspects were a lot of the scenes that were lifted directly from the graphic novel. Also, they were very faithful to the specific dead animals in the graphic novel. For example, these included, I think in order, a cat, which in the graphic novel is found at the very beginning on the road before we see a scene with Jeffrey Dahmer watching the jogger from a bus. But then we see in the movie the opposite blocking of those scenes where we see Dahmer go by on the bus and watch the jogger, and then a few seconds later we see him come and pick up the cat. Then we see him steal a fetal pig from his science class, and later we see him brutally stab a sunfish, and then he picks up a dead possum at another point. There's also a scene where he's fairly merciful with a dog, and that's true to the graphic novel as well, although I don't know how to verify whether or not that ever actually happened in real life. The mall scene is the same in both the graphic novel and in the film, and the film does a really good job of illustrating the recurring theme of isolation that we see in the graphic novel. We see the graphic novel, Jeff starts out isolated and then he becomes a little less isolated. He starts to normalize and try to get friends, and it seems like things are improving a little bit for him, and then we see him slowly crumbling. We see everything falling apart around him, partially through his own doing, and partially because of his parents' incredibly messy divorce. And the first scene in the movie where we see Jeff acting strangely to amuse his friends, which is mimicking a decorator with cerebral palsy, although in the graphic novel he was actually also mimicking his own mother's fits because of her medications and her mental illnesses. But anyway, the first scene that we see him do that in is in the hallway of his school, and all of the people watch and react to it, and we see them all laughing around him, and then they're no longer amused, and so they disappear, and he's left by himself. And then at the end, we see him walking through the mall, everyone laughing along, and then they disperse, and then he's left alone. And that theme of isolation is carried throughout both works, and I think is done very well in both. The movie also is not a particularly rosy portrayal of the character, and neither is the graphic novel. I think they both make a point to acknowledge that there was always something dark and not right about Jeffrey Dahmer. His fascination with the insides of bodies, his fantasies about necrophilia, all of these things make sense in contextualizing the crimes he would eventually go on to commit, but they do not excuse them, and I don't think that they should. I remember there's one scene that Jeffrey Dahmer's father wrote about where and this is not in the movie or the graphic novels, but this is when his father realized there was something wrong with Jeff, and that's when they were outside and they were raking leaves, and they found a skeletonized bird in the leaves. And Jeff started to play with the bird's bones with a kind of fascination, and something about that just shifted the way he saw his son for a moment. And I think deep down he knew that something terrible was going to happen with his son. I think that was an early warning sign that just kind of gave him a hint, but I don't think it would click until much later. And so, again, this film is a portrayal, and this graphic novel is a portrayal of Jeffrey Dahmer before that story. We see him as normal as he ever was, and we understand a little better how his behavior escalated to the point that it did, and how the few cries for help he may have had were unanswered. And the important question it asks is, where were the adults? How did he slip through the cracks to this degree? And I think that's what we really do need to focus on in terms of thinking about this story. How did this happen? I don't know. But I think that it's important to think about. So I would absolutely recommend checking out this movie if you're a fan of true crime, or if you're a fan of the horror or thriller genre. I'd be careful to, again, remember that this is a movie based on a true story that impacted at least hundreds of lives very directly, and there is a sensitivity with which we need to approach this content. That's everything I have for you on this. If you enjoy my videos, like and subscribe. If you don't, I am sure you will tell me. Let me know what you think of My Friend Dahmer in the comments down below, or what you think about content based on true crime in general. I would love to hear your thoughts, whether you agree or disagree. Wiedersehen.